Why would a God who once thundered from the mountain and parted seas suddenly fall completely silent? That's the haunting mystery of the 400 years between the Old and New Testaments, the years when no prophet spoke, no angel visited, no fresh word from God was heard. For long centuries, heaven seemed to close its mouth. And if you've ever walked through a season where God seemed distant or even absent, then you already know a fragment of what Israel must have felt. But here's the secret most people miss. God's silence doesn't mean his absence, it often means his preparation. You see, while the people waited in confusion and spiritual hunger, God was setting the stage for the arrival of Jesus in ways no one could see. Hidden behind the silence were empires rising and falling, languages being unified under Greek, roads being built by Rome, and hearts being broken wide open by longing. Micah had already prophesied that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Isaiah had foretold a virgin birth. But the gap between promise and fulfillment felt like a void. That's where you might be right now, stuck in the in-between, waiting on a word, a healing, a breakthrough. And yet, just like Israel, you may not realize that silence can be sacred. Think about this. The last prophetic voice in the Old Testament, Malachi, ended with a warning and a promise, the warning of judgment and the promise of a coming Elijah-like figure. Then nothing, for 400 years. But when the silence finally broke, it was with the cry of a baby in Bethlehem. It was with John the Baptist crying out in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord." That moment didn't come out of nowhere, it was the result of centuries of divine orchestration. And maybe that's what God is doing with you. Maybe the reason you haven't heard anything new is because he's still developing what he already said. Maybe the next word isn't delayed, it's deepening. Because silence from God often isn't about punishment, it's about positioning. Romans 8:28 reminds you that all things, even the quiet, hidden seasons, are working together for good. And here's something else. In the silence, God was refining what kind of Messiah people expected. They wanted a political king. He sent a suffering servant. They expected domination. He brought humility. So ask yourself, in your own silence, what are you expecting from God? What if he's preparing to exceed it in ways that will undo your limited understanding? When you feel forgotten, remember this: Israel wasn't abandoned. They were being aligned. And maybe your hidden season is where your roots are growing. Zechariah 4:10 says, "Do not despise these small beginnings." Why? Because what's silent today may shake the world tomorrow. So if you're in a quiet season, hold on. Because God's silence isn't empty, it's pregnant. Something is forming. Something is coming. And when the silence breaks, it won't be with noise. It will be with purpose. Now, let me ask you, have you mistaken God's silence for distance? Or are you starting to see that it might actually be design? Because here's what most never realize: while no prophet spoke for 400 years, God was still moving pieces into place, with quiet precision. The religious systems that developed in that time, like the Pharisees and Sadducees, though later rebuked by Jesus, became the backdrop against which his radical message of grace would shine brighter. And the longing, that spiritual thirst, it created a desperation that only the Messiah could satisfy. Without the silence, the hunger would not have existed. The darkness of the gap made the light of Christ unmistakable. And isn't that the pattern you've seen in your life too? The deepest revelations often come after the darkest seasons. God doesn't waste silence, he layers it with meaning. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." Stillness isn't just the absence of movement, it's the birthplace of revelation. It's where noise fades and the eternal voice becomes clear. That's what happened when Mary heard the angel, when Joseph dreamed his dream, when the shepherds saw the sky split open. They had been living in generational silence, but their hearts were tuned by waiting. And maybe that's exactly what God is doing with you right now, not ignoring you, but tuning you, breaking your dependence on noise, on signs, on answers, and teaching you how to lean into trust instead. That kind of trust can't be taught in a storm, it's learned in stillness. And maybe that's why he's been quiet, not to push you away, but to pull you deeper. Because when the word finally became flesh, it wasn't a trumpet blast, it was a whisper in a manger. So let me ask you again, what if the silence you hate is the soil your calling is growing in? What if the pain of not hearing God is actually proof that he's preparing something worth the wait? You may not feel it now, but when the fullness of time comes, you will see what he was doing in the dark. And even now, in this very moment, you might be realizing that the silence wasn't empty after all, it was holy. It was heaven holding its breath before the greatest unveiling in human history. And what if your life is in that same kind of pause? What if you're not being overlooked, but preserved? What if you're not in a delay, but in a divine incubation? Galatians 4:4 says, "But when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth his Son." Fullness, not before, not after, but exactly on time. So what if your breakthrough has an appointment, and it won't arrive 1 second early or late? That means your job isn't to force it to remain faithful, to trust in the dark, to worship in the quiet, because faith that survives silence is the kind that changes everything. That's the kind of faith Jesus saw in the woman who touched his robe, in the centurion who believed from afar, in the blind man who shouted louder when everyone told him to stop. They kept believing even when they hadn't heard a word. And maybe that's your assignment too, not to chase noise, but to steward the stillness, to lean in, listen closely, and realize God may be silent, but he is never still. Every moment of silence is filled with motion. You can't see wheels turning, doors opening, angels moving. And in time, the silence will break, not because you earned it, but because it was always part of the plan. So if you've been walking through your own 400 years, wondering if the heavens forgot your name, I want to tell you this: God hasn't gone quiet to hurt you. He's gone quiet to prepare you. And what comes after the silence will be more beautiful, more powerful, and more perfectly timed than you ever dared to imagine. Thank you for staying to the end. Now tell me, in your own words, what has God been whispering to you in the quiet places?